Our next guest is the strategic advisor on climate change at OFAN and the former ambassador to the United Nations from Grenada. So please welcome Ambassador DESSIMA Williams, who is joining us remotely from Grenada. Thank you, Ambassador, for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Ambassador, you're passionate about educating people about the urgency of tackling the climate crisis. What has been the public response, and what is the best way to deliver this message throughout the civil society in a way that they can personally connect?
Thank you very much. The main impacts of climate change started to visit the SIDS, the small island developing countries. And I started that journey in 2009. And we found that our publics were already educating themselves and becoming engaged because the impacts were on them so intensely. We are the most vulnerable countries in the world. And so I would say that the SIDS led the international public response to understanding what was really unfolding with climate change. We now have momentum, but it wasn't always that. In fact, I'm pleased to say that we have momentum among a very ambitious goal of limiting average global warming to no more than 1.5. I think the presidents of Kiribati, of Vanuatu, of Fiji have been on the forefront, on the front lines. There are two prime ministers from Grenada. So if you will, I want to insist that many of the small island states who felt this terrific early impact have been very active in getting the message out.
What would you say, Ambassador, is the biggest threat in Grenada and the wider Caribbean region as a result of the climate change?
Well, the threats are at all levels. It's a threat for survival, first and foremost. As the sea level rises, we have many coastal communities. Our full infrastructure is on the coastal areas, our seaports, our tourist docking ports, our roads, villages, they're all mainly on the coastline. So that's quite a threat to our lives, to our infrastructure, to our mangroves, to our seacoast agriculture, even on a cultural level, because in one of our smaller islands, the cemeteries are near to the sea, and the sea is rising up and stealing away the very graves of people buried. But there's more than that. There are impacts on impact on our water supply, the impact on excuse me, the impact psychologically. We're never sure when is the dry season anymore and when is the rainy season. They've merged a bit. So planting and growing and harvesting are also under threat from the impacts of climate change.
Ambassador, what would you say are the most vulnerable populations to the climate crisis in Grenada, and what makes them more vulnerable?
Everyone is vulnerable in a small island. An island the size of Washington, D.C., twice that size. It means that whether it's a sea level rise or torrential rains or high winds, all the island is impacted. And however, we could turn to the coastal areas, and they are the most vulnerable, the poorest in the worst housing or farming areas will remain the most vulnerable populations. But I'd like to say that on small islands, such as Grenada, many populations, physical infrastructure, projects for development are constantly threatened. Of course, our finance is threatened because rebuilding is costly, whether for individual families or for the state. In the case of Grenada in 2004, we lost 200% of our GDP in Hurricane Ivan. And so the hurricanes threaten our sustainable development and our economic development.
Ambassador, you have said that the Sustainable Development Goals should be a responsibility of everyone and not just in the hands of governments. Can you identify these goals specifically and how members of the civil society can attain them in their daily lives?
Let me then remain on the climate goal in the SDGs, climate goal number 13, which calls for climate action. Everyone has to be engaged in that, in education. This year, one of our national secondary school debates was on the climate. That's a form of response. The population is switching to more solar, little wind. That is a response, and that's also SDG number 7 on energy. We are making a very slow transition to electric cars. I hope to see more of that in the future. We're also using less plastics. There is a movement to reduce single-use plastic and to increase cloth and straw, and I think that's part of the national response as well. I'd like to put in a plug here for the national governmental response, which is to build resilience. There is now a concerted effort to mainstream the concept of resilience, and Grenada will probably be one of the first countries in the world to have a Ministry of Climate Resilience, so that we can educate and we can accelerate a range of SDGs. I want to speak also about education, that we are including in our education skills building, vocational and technical skills that will help us with a new kind of organic and climate resilient agriculture. And even for our big tourism is our big sector, to educate all stakeholders about the risk of tourism. I think we have more to do. We have to improve our land use policy. We have to really make more financing available, both for communities as well as for the state, although we have a bit of a head start in the Green Climate Fund and in the SIDS DOC, which is our renewable energy platform for the islands of the world. So I think as far as the SDGs are concerned, the climate threat will make attaining the SDGs impossible. So educating about sustainability and resilience, practicing many policies, for example, SDG 2, to eliminate and reduce our food waste. We have a national Zero Hunger Commission that's part of our response to SDG number 2. And I must mention women. I must mention that we have a vigorous women's movement. It's a little weak now, but it has historically been very strong in getting women to the decision-making table, which is SDG number 5, has to be and is part of the response, whether that is in civil society or in the private sector or in the state. We do have an increasing number of women in the decision-making sector, or so that we can, in fact, take on board women's experiences, women's knowledge, and of course, our ideas and suggestions.
And those are wonderful initiatives, Ambassador. Thank you so much for being with us and for all the work that you do. Thank you.